Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. So Dr. Christopher Scanlon's clinical background is a consultant psychotherapist in general, adult and forensic mental health in the NHS. He's a group analyst. He's also a training group analyst at the Institute of Group Analysis. He's also worked at the Henderson Hospital, the pioneering NHS facility for people with severe personality disorders. I've always known you as Chris. Chris, is it okay to call you Chris? Okay. You're also, I know this from checking on your Tavistock Clinic page, one of the best connected people that I ever come across. So I found it quite difficult to actually describe your work or occupation. Do you think you'd be able to sum that up in a few words for us?
Well, I suppose I've worked in mental health services for 40 years, really, man and boy, I suppose. My original training was as a nurse, actually, so the psychotherapy stuff came later, but I've tended to work with people that I would describe as having a sort of complex trauma-related histories, so in therapeutic communities and in groups. I think my orientation I would describe as a sort of psychosocial, which is nuanced in the sense that it's slightly different to psychoanalytic, but not psychoanalytic, but I would say psychosocial. Does that help? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good way of describing things. So most of your time now is spent on within groups and lecturing.
Yeah, it's a combination of clinical work, consultancy, and some teaching and lecturing and some research supervision. I'm just beginning to do a bit of that, so it's all in the same sort of territory about trying to think about the individual in context and whether that. So in a way, whether we start talking about the clients and patients, we end up talking about the organisation, and if you end up talking about the organisation, usually end up thinking about, the patients in terms of how their anxieties play out in the systems. Group analytics, systems, psychodynamic, psychosocial, to my mind, are sort of interchangeable, but some people get a bit possessive about these words, I think.
It's good to have you here today, Chris, and I think we were keen to get you on right from the start because David and I's thinking behind why we wanted to start the podcast was thinking about some of these services that have got reputations for managing work that's actually very complex and very difficult and doing a good job of that, and then ultimately ending up closing. And of course, you were very closely associated with working at the Henderson, and I wondered if you could tell us a bit about how you came to be working there and what attracted you to the work.
Well, when I was working as a nurse, I trained in Surrey, which is just round the corner really from Henderson, and so some of my friends went to work there, and I didn't at the time, but I was always part of a conversation, and I didn't really. One thing and another, but it was only having done the psychotherapy training that I formally applied and got the position, which was consultant. What was it? I was a consultant psychotherapist, but I was also the lead for training and consultancy, and my role was in the outreach service. So it was, in reaching into the community and outreaching from the community. But it was doing quite a lot of work with referral networks and preparation and an assessment. I suppose you'd call it assessment, but it was more preparation work so that we could try to, in a way, protect the community from having to have too much involvement with the outside world on the one hand, but on the other hand, inevitably bringing the outside world in. So it was very much that sort of interface between the therapeutic community and the network, the wider networks. Well, yeah, I mean, every role in that place was challenging one way or the other, but for a long time, Henderson was around for 40 years or so, maybe longer, but without any sort of outreach function, so that the community in a way had managed itself by, in very particular ways, so that people just sort of were referred, turned up for assessment, often without really knowing what they were letting themselves in for, and some took to it and some didn't, but there was always a sense in which a bit of assessment and preparation was going to help people at least to understand a little better in terms of a sort of ethical, informed consent, about what they were letting themselves in for, because very often some of the residents that were referred there were referred by people who just wanted to move them on. They weren't particularly thinking, what's the best place for this person, and didn't necessarily know anything about Henderson Hospital or treatment services. So, they were often, I suppose you'd say, often sort of challenging, heart-sink, unpopular patients with the system of referrers, so that they weren't terribly good at explaining what it was or getting any sort of sign-up. And I think that's a big issue, because it's a huge commitment, was a huge commitment, a residential. It was, there was only one thing that you were referred to. There was one treatment modality, which was the residential 365-day residential treatment. And so, in effect, to go there, you had to give up your work, give up your home. If you had work, if you had a home. Of course, a lot of people that we saw had neither a work or a home. But to relocate from wherever you were into a sort of specialist, intense service that was dedicated really from the off to confronting you in a sort of particular sort of way with your trauma, really, and getting a sort of sign up for that or a consent for that, I think, was something that I always felt was a bit missing before, and the outreach team brought that sort of function in. But it also meant that we were working with the referrers quite a lot to try and help them make sense of the problem that their clients had, because I think that I try very hard not to use this concept of personality disorder. I find it extremely unhelpful sort of medical model, but the gateway and referral in was often through medical model people, so you had to try to translate to the patients or the referrals, what we meant by what we thought they might have meant by thinking about personality disorder. And I don't think the Henderson Hospital did particularly foreground the personality disorder thing until quite late on, where there was a sort of need to describe things for research purposes and funding purposes and all sorts of other things. So very often the people referred had no idea what was wrong with them, other than they were deeply unhappy and caught up in horrible cycles of destructiveness. And very often the sort of psychiatrists, psychologists who were engaging with them hadn't really got a clear formulation of what was wrong with them either. They just experienced them as difficult and wanted to move them on. And many of them, were stuck. So a lot of them were stuck in hospital. So a lot of the referrals came from people. When the outreach team came, they were from people that were in hospital, and just bed blocking or whatever the term may be, and acting out and not being able to move them on. Prior to that, you had to be able to catch a bus to Sutton, and and find your way there one way or the other. Whereas when the outreach service, we would often engaging with people who were already in hospital, trying to sort of talk to them about why they'd be better off in a different hospital, which was always a bit of a difficult conversation to have.
I think you touched on something really interesting there, though, about the label of personality disorder, because I remember when I was just in my final year of training, hearing the label and thinking what an awful label to give to somebody, and yet finding that sometimes it had to be used in order to engage other staff and to enable people to access a service. It was awful that people kind of had to accept that diagnosis in order to be provided with a service, and there was I think in those days, much less understanding or willingness to engage with the idea that actually it was an adaptation to trauma. So, you spoke in your introduction about having this commitment to working with people who've got complex trauma in their history, and yet you were choosing at a time to work with a population who quite often they were viewed with contempt or distaste, weren't they? And I wonder what it was about that you were able to see that there was a different way to look at the position that made you want to engage with a population who many other mental health professionals were actively choosing to avoid. You spoke about them as being heart sink patients, but I wondered if you could say a bit more about why there was this antipathy towards this kind of patient.
Well, I suppose you'd have to ask them why they were so antipathetic to the patients, but my sense was that they didn't take up, like from a psychosocial perspective, they wouldn't take up the role that was allocated to them, the role of patient-client, so in a way they disturbed and upset the system, because they were supposed to be grateful. Thank you, doctor. Thank you, nurse, for helping me out. And very often they weren't. And so in a way, I thought I always I always described personality disorder. In fact, one of the papers I wrote was called interpersonality disorder, because it was always a sense of working with the disturbance of the system at the interface of the disturbance of an individual. And in my opinion, the mental health system is extremely dysfunctional and always has been. I think as long as it's dominated by, sort of a medical model that's coercive and diagnostic and biomedical, then there isn't actually a treatment available for people unless you can give them a pill. There is no pharmacology. I mean, many of these patients were on, endless cocktails of drugs, but, I always used to feel that, if they wanted to sort of think about that anxiety and that relationship, it might be more advisable if for the doctor to take the tranquilizer rather than give it to the patient, but, because it was always a moot point as to where the anxiety was located, really. And so very often, they're tranquilized in order to shut them up. They're sent away in order to shut them up, and of course they're very sensitive to rejection and abandonment because of their early history. So, there's these vicious cycles of deterioration. Means that in many ways, I think that a traumatized individual presenting themselves straightforwardly as a traumatized individual doesn't get related to as such, and by the time they're diagnosed as personality disorder, the diagnosis is really about their mismanagement by the mental health service. In that sense, the picture you're seeing, at the time of referral is more, and iatrogenic production that's been caused by their failed interactions and the incapacity of the system to relate to them. And by and large, the medical establishment, if you can't give a pill for it, then it makes the doctors, not all of obviously, but it makes doctors feel inadequate, because that's what they're trained to do, diagnose and treat. This sort of idea that there's a pill for trauma is, there isn't. So, what was it? Was it Biono said, that there's always, that in any sort of clinical encounter there ought to be two frightened people in the room. And somehow the mental health system failed to notice that, that they were frightened and disturbed by the patient. It was always the patient that was frightening and disturbing. So it was their problem, their fault. Move them on. And some of the people were treated abusively, really, by the system, certainly very judgmentally, which then just recreates and reproduces the childhood histories that many of them had, which was of rejection and abandonment and misunderstanding. Whereas I think if had they straightforwardly come forward at an early age, childhood, to somebody somewhere, and been able to sort of be noticed and seen for what was going on for them, you wouldn't get to the point of being as disturbed and as damaged as adults as many of these people were. So I think it's a damning indictment, really, of mental health services for adults, but also mental health services for children, but also education systems that in our country, because so many of these young people, some of these people as young people, were not attended to and abused and mistreated. And in that sense, that's what I'm hanging on to about the idea that it's a psychosocial problem rather than a psychological problem. Because if we imagine it's a psychological problem or a psychiatric problem and they've got it, then we miss something about the sort of politics and the exclusion and the rejection and and the racism and all the rest of it that has thrown up these disturbances within individuals. So.
That's very powerfully and clearly put, Chris. It's a pleasure to hear such an articulate argument. Were you able to have this kind of discourse at the Henderson, or was it just not necessary, really, because everyone was on the same page, as it were?
Well, I think by the time they got there, in a way, that was the conversation. So, in a way, if they engaged in it, then that was the conversation. It was about trying to in a way, I always, Stuart Whiteley wrote an interesting paper once upon about the and Harold Bridger before, about the sort of the idea that it's all about sociotherapy. In a sense, there are psychotherapists, and the psychotherapists that are employed, and have had a particular training, whether it's a medical training or a nursing training or a social work training, whatever it happens to be, they might define themselves and be described as psychotherapists. But I never myself felt that Henderson was offering psychotherapy, not alone. It was offering this psychosocial intervention, which was about groups and the living, the living learning experience. It's people, many of these people had forgotten, if they ever knew, how to relate to other people in ordinary ways. So if what you do is sort of replace this this gap with an intense psychological transference-based treatment, then you're just shoving something further and further in, I think. So that part of the treatment at the Henderson, some of it was about the groups and the therapies and the psychodrama and so on, but an awful lot of it was about being with other people in one way or another, cooking together, negotiating how to lock the doors at night and how to eat and cook and be together and organise a trip to the pictures and all of these things. And there was a piece of research done at Henderson at one point which was just asking people, what was the key moments, looking back at their treatment, what sort of things had stood out for them as pivotal and life-changing or whatever, and almost none of them said it was anything to do with the psychotherapy, the formal structures. It was almost all about, the people that they'd met, the encounters that they'd had. And I think that's one of the things that I find with the therapeutic communities that remain, particularly in the prison system, which is where I'm doing some work at the moment, is that they really have lost an awful lot of that sociotherapy bit. The Henderson used to employ people who were called social therapists, and they were employed because they didn't have a formal training. They were, if you like, ordinary people with an interest in the work. So they would come and ask the naive questions and have the ordinary relationships that were very often the most significant ones. Whereas in the prison system, it's very hard to recreate that idea of social or activity or cooking together. There's just many other places that just don't do that. And, the staff that might do that, the prison officers, again, have got a different role, to take up. And that the psychotherapists, one of the things about the psychotherapists, for instance, is it was always very telling, the ones that couldn't metaphorically and sometimes literally take off their tie, or their jacket, so that they were always, as it were, imagining themselves to be psychotherapists or psychologists or psychiatrists, rather than a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist in context. In this particular context, in this particular community, the hierarchies that we are traditionally around in society don't apply in the same way, that we need to learn to speak to each other more horizontally and therefore more personally, rather than, using the traditional hierarchies about who tells whom to do what. And it's very telling about the people that couldn't make that adjustment. They just remained psychiatrists or they remained psychotherapists or social workers and couldn't join this sort of blurring, a deliberate, constructive, professional blurring that was necessary to become a therapeutic community practitioner.
There's no kind of like training for that in people's courses, is there? And I know kind of like going to work in I've worked in 2 residential services, and in both of those, a clear, significant part of the role was having those kind of like normal human contacts and connections with people. But you're right, you can see people who struggle because they don't want to give anything of themselves beyond the kind of like the front of being psychologist or psychotherapist. And yeah, I think that part is so undervalued. The milieu gets viewed as being much less potent, and all the emphasis goes on the formal therapies, when actually all this other stuff is far more important, as you say.
Not only that, but I think that's also partly what contributed to the demise of the therapeutic community, certainly at Henderson, and I think the others, is because the measures, the way of describing the treatment and the measures that apply to treatments, all come from a particular psychological frame. Has this person improved in this way or that, or according to this measure or that measure, in relation to this intervention? Well, if you can't describe the intervention in a way, then you can't randomise it and control it, and so you can't get the traditional scientific support. And I think part of the problem for the Henderson at that time, although the evidence for general evidence, a lot of research over a lot of time, was that it was the residents felt better, got better, did all sorts of things. That what wasn't understood by the traditional scientist is, okay, so what's the treatment, so that we can then, distill it, so that we can then measure the variables and so work out what it is that's effective then. I said, well, you can't distill it. So I remember I used to go to conferences, and occasionally you'd have a presentation from an art therapist in the therapeutic community describing the ways in which art therapy was effective, for instance, in a therapeutic community, to which I would always point out that you can't, because art therapy is part of a whole range of other activities, and it might well be that those activities taken as a whole are effective, and the art therapy clearly is contributing to that, but you can't say that this is therefore an indication that art therapy is effective, because it's a multimodal, multi-active sort of treatment, and in a way the failure of the world to understand groups and all the sort of varied aspects of group. There's just too many variables in a group, and so you end up measuring improvement in very individualistic terms. And that one of the things that we always used to say, that that some of the ideas of success that we saw very often were that people after treatment would be better able to take up the offer of help from the mental health system than they were before. Whereas the expectation, madly, was that once someone's had a treatment, they won't need any more mental health support. But actually these were very, very damaged and traumatised people, and the fact that they could take up, go back to the person that referred them and take up a different sort of relationship with them, we would consider a terrific success, but often they would consider this to be a relapse or a failure in some sort of way, and those conversations were just too difficult and too nuanced in an environment that became increasingly rivalrous and envious, so that even people that were supposed to be friends ended up being enemies. But we could maybe come to that in a second. But but when you're up against, as it were, the gold standard randomised control trial as the evidence for for what gets funded, Henderson couldn't do that. In fact, there was one time when I was there where there was more or less a threat. I think it was a straightforward threat from Professor of Psychiatry, who remained nameless, Peter Tyra, who sort of threatened the Henderson with its future because we refused to subject ourselves to a randomised controlled trial of his design, or indeed of any randomised controlled trial, because part of our concern would be that half the people would get nothing, and that getting nothing when you're that damaged it means that you're likely to die. So sending someone away because of some sort of randomised design, was something that we decided absolutely unanimously that we would not do. But of course that then makes enemies out of people who are very influential and very powerful, who've got their own treatment modality that they then want to promote, and so on and so forth. Whereas back in the day, there were very few, but let's say personality disorder treatment services, hardly any, in the country. I mean, there were some in general adult services, hardly any. You got the Castle, it's a very particular model, Henderson, but there were very few others. And then suddenly, there was a big burgeoning of it when, around the time of the no longer a diagnosis of exclusion and all that sort of stuff, suddenly everybody wants to set up a personality disorder service, and the very patients that no one wanted to treat before suddenly are cash cows, and everybody wants a slice of it. And then they'll come along with their particular psychological modality that's been subjected to randomised control experiments because it could be, or they were less concerned with the ethics. And then the discourse about effectiveness of Henderson starts to sort of fall away. In fact, the most persuasive bit of evidence, I think, was a rather neat piece of work that eventually we realised, that nobody cared whether these people got better or not, or felt better or not, or whatever. So all these psychological sort of investigations into whether people were improving according to this measure or that measure wasn't really having the impact that we thought it might have done. So that there was a piece of work that just sort of straightforwardly did some economic measurement and just looked at a cohort of people and said, and tried to sort of track and trace their use of services before treatment and add that up as an amount of money, and their use of services after treatment and add that up as an amount of money minus the cost of the treatment, and realise that it was extremely cost effective. It saved the country money, and of course that was then suddenly the commissioners and all these people are thinking, oh, that's interesting, because we didn't understand all that psychological gobbledygook anyway, but we like this bit, that it saves money, and then of course it becomes it saves money, but let's do it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, so that in the end it's it's death by 1,000 cuts, literally.
And often it's the residential aspect that is the bit that's really making the difference as well, isn't it? And yet that's the bit that can look like the most costly. And if you're managing people in a way where people feel safe and valued, then you don't see the kind of behaviours that you would see in a service that's less psychologically safe.
But of course, when you looked at many of the histories of the people and the cost to the country previously, it didn't cost anybody in particular necessarily a huge amount of money, but they were in and out of A&E, they were in and out of prison, they were in and out of psychiatric hospitals, so the residential hotel costs, let's say, for a lot of these clients was very high anyway. It's not like they were just sitting at home watching the television and cutting their wrists or something. They were out there costing a lot of money, and so and that I say that was the most persuasive thing. But the residential aspect, of course, was also the bit that was massively resented by because it's a bit like, well, why should these people have all this money spent on them? Because it does look like a lot of money for a client. Well, it is a lot of money for an individual if you're only looking at the cost of that treatment at Henderson for that individual. It does look like quite a lot of money. So there's partly they're unpopular, undeserving, so why spend that money on them anyway? Gets offset against, well, you're spending an awful lot of money on them anyway. In fact, you're spending more money on them, a lot more money on this problem. So, give them a break, give us all a break. But there was also then the issue that when no longer the diagnosis of exclusion stuff came forward, because I was on that advisory group, and so I was privy to a lot of the sort of really quite nasty and acrimonious competitive battles between all the people that wanted a slice of this money that was then made available. And the fact that the Henderson had a lot of money and was quite well established, and therefore got, in principle, a lot more of the money than they did, the argument started to become, well, actually, it doesn't need to be residential. We can do this in day services, 3-day services, because we can do groups, and we can have a kitchen and make some cakes or something, some sandwiches for lunch, so 3 days a week treatment service. And so again, what was missed, was the importance of that residential safety, and so a lot of these 3-day a week services claimed that they were treating the same patients as was the Henderson, which simply wasn't true. They also claimed that their effectiveness was the same, for which they had no evidence. But these were very powerful and influential and persuasive people. And so when they go to the commissioners and the powers that be and say, actually, we can do this better and cheaper in a 3-day a week service, they, why would the commissioners argue? Because they just look at the bottom line and say, well, okay, you say you can do the same job for a tenth of the price, then we'll have that then. I mean, you can't blame them for that, except it was dishonest and disingenuous and so much tied up with professional rivalries rather than with what the service user or the client needed. And so one of the bits of my particular history was after the Henderson closed, I went to work in other services, and I found myself on the NHS Tier 4 residential advisory group, which surprised me a little bit. And all the same people that had been in the expert advisory group of the no longer diagnosis exclusion were there, and all of them were saying, "Yep, we'll have a residential services in Exeter or Thames Valley or Newcastle or Leeds or whatever, and we'll do it with CBT, DBT, MBT, whatever acronym you like." And we've got all the evidence for CBT, DBT. No, none of them have run a residential service whatsoever. And I was astonished in this room, and I remember that there was the civil servant that was running it. So it was NHS England was running it, with a civil servant, because they were seriously looking at having to recommission a residential service because these day service didn't work, and that they were very seriously challenged people who now had no residential places to go. So in effect, they had to reinvent the wheel. All right, well, what we need is a residential service. And I got a bit impatient about this, and I just said, well, in order to think about that, first we might need to think about what went wrong in the commissioning, not in the work of, but in the commissioning of the residential services that we did have. We had a national service with Henderson and in London and the South East, Main House in Birmingham and the Midlands, and there's Webb House in Manchester. There was a national service, including the castle. They've all gone. Before you start dreaming up another one, you need to understand why have they gone. And it was astonishing because the civil servant, very senior civil servant who was chairing the group, just looked at me and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And I said, well, what I'm suggesting is that you need to be better briefed, because if you want to set up a residential service, a national service on behalf of NHS England, you might want to notice that there was one, and it collapsed because of a failure of the commissioning process to effectively support it. Because it didn't fail for clinical reasons at all. It failed entirely because of the competitiveness, the rivalry, and the incapacity to commission it within this internal market purchaser provider thing that took over, disastrously so many years ago in the health service. So part of why it closed, in terms of the model, I would say there was absolutely nothing about the model that was. There's obviously always developments and improvements and things that could be done. And I was part of that in terms of the outreach and so on. But it failed because of the move, I think, generally in society towards a more individualistic, neoliberal sort of way of thinking about the individual and the primacy, and groups and communities. That's just old hippie stuff, isn't it? Really, we don't do that anymore. Communism, is that what you call it? No, communalism. Oh, communism. Oh, we don't like that idea at all. No. Surely we have to call it something else, don't we? Isn't there a 3-letter acronym we could have? So we gave them one, which was DTC, a Democratic Therapeutic Community, and they were quite happy with that. They liked the idea of a DTC.
So, Chris, that civil servant who you addressed, how did he take your feedback to him?
Well, it was a she actually, but she was very good actually, because I think she was embarrassed that she hadn't been briefed, and they were very, very senior people in the room, and when I said it, actually, you could have heard a pin drop for a while. There's a complete silence in the room, and then eventually someone says, "Well, I think, Chris, you're still a bit bitter about the Henderson." And I said, damn right I am, and that, and I'm pleased to be part of this thing, because if you set another thing up to fail without understanding why the Henderson failed when there was nothing really wrong with it, then you're just throwing good money after bad. Anyway, so there was this sort of argument, and the civil servant person was sort of went, oh yes, well of course, I'll, and looked at the chair. He was because he could do everything for everybody. That chappie, but then what happened is there was a moment actually in that meeting where this voice appeared from the middle of the table, because they'd got one of those spidery things in the middle of the table. And everyone had forgotten. I'd certainly forgotten about it. And I think everybody had, because there's such tension in this room. And this voice just emerged from the table and said, "Well, I completely agree with what Chris is saying, and that we really do need to understand what happened, and what in relation to the failure of adequate commissioning for the services we already had." Because it's not about whether you do DBT, CBT, MBT, or any of these other things. It failed because of the commissioning and the political will. And of course, the person that spoke had much more gravitas and bottom than me. And so suddenly we could have that conversation. We couldn't have it when I spoke to it, because I was, either too angry, too bitter, or too junior. Because it was Mark Morris, actually, Naomi, whose voice it was. And of course he's a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist and a very senior person with a national profile and all that. So he could be listened to. And I was very grateful to him, because it was very clear that I was just going to be put to one side. But also, I don't think there was even then a political will to establish this tier for NHS-funded service, because actually what happened was that the contract was placed with the Signet Group, which is an independent for-profit organisation that's in low secure forensic services, and I think they had the DBT acronym. So now all the taxpayers and public money that would have gone into their health service now goes straight into the independent hospital sector. So I don't think they were very serious about establishing an NHS service anyway. Partly because psychiatrists cost a lot of money, and all the rest of it. So they just put it into the private sector. So the private sector was the net beneficiary of the closure of the Henderson. And a lot of the NHS people didn't see that coming. I don't know why, but I did. Because so much of the movement was in that direction at that time. Wider political movement was in that direction. Yeah. Anyway, I'm sure you asked me a question before I started ranting, but I don't know what it was.
Some time ago. But nevertheless, you've given us a really rich description of those difficult times, which were particularly difficult for people at the Henderson, of course, and how the economic climate and what you described as the cash cow of the PD movement, what kind of powerful influence that had, which resonates very strongly with me, I must say.
Well, I would just add one thing at the end of that rant, and that is that all of the people who thought that they would be beneficiaries of this money, all of those services have closed. The 3-day services that took the money, they've all gone as well. So I don't think they realised, that together we stand, divided we fall, and of course divided we fell. And that's partly my bitterness, is that some of the people that could have been more groupish in working together actually became very competitive, very individualistic, and as a consequence there is no meaningful service for people with complex trauma in the UK at the moment. There isn't one.
And I wonder, David, if there's a question here about whether those services looking at the cash cow might have been replaced by the prison service, but I'm not bold enough to ask that question yet. Well, I think the prison service see. So obviously, I can't say this on the thing, but I think the prison service see the OPD money as cash cow money, and most of it comes from the NHS. But there's a danger of that being handed over to the prison service, and yet the pathway services exist because the prison service wasn't capable of running services for that client group. That's why NHS staff are in there.
Well, I think that's right. I think that's part of the story. I think the other bit of the story is that the NHS trusts that have been tendering for this work, whether it's in the prison service or anywhere else, no longer have people at the right level who know what it is that they're buying or selling. Not, the trusts that are hosting some of these interventions into the prison service have no idea how to support a service working with this level of complexity. They have no idea at all how to do it, because the other contributing factor to the closure of the Henderson was that the movement around that time to establish these foundation NHS trusts, which became bigger and bigger and bigger, and therefore more and more bureaucratic, and therefore more and more policy and procedure based. And in that sense, the Henderson, which was a significant specialist treatment service of a particular size, in its own sense could be considered its own department in a smaller trust, becomes, as far as the policies are concerned, just like an acute ward. So the Henderson is subject to the same policies and procedures as any other ward in the hospital system. There was one. There were so many moments, but the one that comes to mind was the dangerousness of the coat hangers. That suddenly somebody had decided at some point, far away, that coat hangers were extremely dangerous things, and so we were required to go through the therapeutic community and remove everybody's coat hangers. Of course, that was what we were required to do. So that's how we had to have a conversation, to sit down with the clients and residents and say, look, and it becomes this joke about how these terrifying, dangerous coat hangers lurking in your wardrobe. Be very careful; they could leap out and attack you in some sort of way. But of course, it was all about ligature points and all this sort of stuff. So, you get subject to the same policies and procedures without recognising that the work that you're doing is significantly different, with a different model. So the other bit about the Henderson was very unique, and I don't think has been. I don't know many places, if any places, that do it. Was that the people going to the Henderson were selected for treatment by the residential community. No professional person, however senior, could refer somebody in to the Henderson for treatment. They could only refer them to a selection group where they would meet with other residents and staff. It was usually 3/4 residents, 1/4 staff, that sort of proportion. Each person having a vote, and that if they were accepted, it was by the residents. And of course, that's very important, because the residents have got to live with these people, very closely, and so people, of course, were sometimes not accepted because of the state of the community, rather than the state of the individual. If you bring a very disturbed person into a very disturbed environment, it's not going to help the environment. It's not going to help the individual, and so, the judgment becomes, I don't think we can do this now. And that's a very nuanced and thoughtful discussion. But for the referrer, it's that, you've thwarted my ambition to refer someone, into, it's as if, I've had many conversations with psychiatrists who'd say, a bunch of PDs think they know better how to treat my patients than I do. And you go, yeah, that is the model, mate, And somehow the affront that would cause was very, very challenging.
That's really familiar, that sense of needing more specialised policies for this population, and you've spoken about that kind of thwarting the senior managers within an organisation. But I wonder how that then impacted on your relationship. The relationship of the Henderson with other agencies that they had to work with.
Well, it was very fraught because at one time, in a way, it was a bit more straightforward. That I don't quite know how it worked back in the day, but if someone was accepted for treatment, then the local referrers would have to pay for it. And what was identified back in the day was that because money was tight and that judgments were not being made, the people who could and should have received some funding to go for treatment at Henderson weren't given it because they weren't undeserving. So that in a way the problem was that people weren't referred because no one wanted to pay, because they weren't worth it, if you see what I mean. So in a way the best decision and the worst decision was that the National Specialists Advisory Commissioning Group, NSCAG, which is a national funding body, said, okay, well, what we'll do to try and crack this is that we will trust you, that if you accept something for treatment, we will just give you the money. Which was a terrific opportunity, really, because it meant that anybody could refer anybody, and that we could go to people and say, refer people. It's not going to come out of your budget. It's going to come out of a central government budget. And so then, of course, the referrals would increase. We'd be able to do some work. The money was forthcoming and it was paid for. And this is where I refer back to the earlier point about the commissioning, is that eventually, though, the NSCAG people, which, that commissioning group was to commission sort of rare treatment for rare conditions. So rather than every trust has to have a pot for a very rare condition, is that they say, well, you're not going to do that, so rare conditions will be funded nationally. But of course, there's nothing rare about personality disorder or traumatised children. It's very, very common. So it challenged the NSCAG's way of doing things. And so eventually they said, well, okay, we'll do this for a while, but it's with a view to the commissioning then dropping back into local commissioning services, as it was before. But by that time, everybody will be much more sensible and grown up, won't they? But of course they weren't, because as soon as that commissioning problem, as soon as it was no longer centrally funded and it was back to the local commissioners to pay for it, they started not wanting to pay for it, which meant that the local trust, the host trust, South West London and St George's, were then the ones running a financial risk, because they were responsible for keeping this service going with an unpredictable income. And they're saying, well, we can't do that. We can't keep a service fully functioning when we don't know what the income is. And so the trust then started to say, well, we cannot operate this business model. And they started coming and saying to us, well, we can't operate this business model, so you're going to have to close. And so it was partly those sorts of conversations that contributed to its closure, because nobody was able to sort of say this is a specialist service, which it is, for a very common problem. It's that second bit that got in the way. I don't know what, 1 in 10 people, isn't it, something like that, could be described as having personality disorder. Start with the Prime Minister and work down. So it's not a common condition, but it is very disabling. And so the implications is that if everybody with a diagnosis of a personality disorder were no longer excluded and that they could access services, those services would go bust immediately. The commissioning services would go bust immediately. And they just couldn't crack that particular nut. and still haven't. I think in the prison service they're sort of forced to deal with that because they've literally got a captive group of people, that are maybe causing a problem and not going anywhere. But I'm not sure how long the specialist PD services are going to last in the prison service anyway. I can't. The other threat that's less visible, but nonetheless present, that went away a bit, maybe in the Blair years, but is back again with a vengeance now, is about the place of the private sector. So that even like Grendon was doing a perfectly good job for an awful long time, and then somebody thought, well, I'm sure that somebody else can do it cheaper, and so Serco pop up and say, yeah, we'll do the same job much cheaper at Dovegate, and so in effect, a comparison study got set up, and the results of that I think are still waiting to come out. In a way, not technically, but how much does Grendon cost compared to how much Dovegate costs? It's got to start to get factored in, because increasingly prisons are becoming privatised in the same way that most of the money, from the track and trace and the COVID thing, so much of that went to Serco and private companies. So I think it's generally about a dismantling of the NHS altogether, of which some are early casualties and others will be later casualties. But I think it is about, why should we, the taxpayer, pay money for these undeserving and difficult people? Homelessness, dangerous people, people in prison. And if you ask the general population, they'll say, well, actually, you've got a good point. Let's not. And increasingly the political manipulation is going down that road. If you don't like them, why should you pay for them? They're not deserving.
Chris, you've given us a brilliant perspective on those difficult, from a social, political perspective, I think, of those difficult, challenging times. I'm wondering if I could drag you back a bit now to being in the positive place of the Henderson, because Naomi and I are really interested in the kind of things which provide individuals or groups, be they staff or patients, with the capacity to develop their creativity, to develop their resilience and sense of self-worth. What were the things about the Henderson that could do that?
Well, I think it was about moving away from Dr. No's best expertise into that sort of very vertical gradient into a much more horizontal gradient, where the people who know best about the lived experience of trauma and rejection are people who've not only, but there's as much a contribution to be made by people with lived experience of that as there is of the trained mental health professionals. So I think it was always this holding together of experts by training and experts by experience, and having a genuine respect for the expertise of lived experience, without, as it were, and having a long enough trajectory of treatment so that people can start the treatment, as it were, not having that expertise, in the same way that a nurse or a doctor starts their training without that level of expertise, but over a period of treatment genuinely becomes expert in the treatment of the new people. And because it was a year-long treatment, it meant that some of the people that had the high credibility, the been there, done that, got the T-shirt people, were the people coming towards the end of the treatment, who could then engage with people at the beginning of the treatment in the way in which the professionals just wouldn't have been trusted to have that conversation. Trust me, I'm a doctor. Yeah, right. That's worked well for me in my life. And so so it's something about really genuinely locating a significant amount of the authority with and the empowerment of the people who are, as it were, the clients. And I think that's the democratic or the democratizing principle. And I do feel that that has been massively underestimated when you go back to the three-letter acronyms, and which are everywhere. Now. What's this? Well, what's your service? Well, it's a DBT or a compassion focused or a dialectical focused or a mentalized focused or all of this stuff, all of which are expert models that say doctor knows best. And why would anybody who's had the experience that they've had trust that automatically? Trust me, I'm a doctor. No. Trust me, I'm a teacher. No. Trust me, I'm your mum. No. Trust me, I'm your mate. I've been there. I've seen I've had that experience. Yeah, okay. And so this, and I think it's, about that sort of working together alongside each other, and then really thinking about those gradients and those hierarchies, because so much of the abuse that people had suffered were suffered because of relationships of power, with powerful people. So they're never going to trust the authorities. Why would they? Why should they? It's not sensible. And so part of the selection group at the Henderson, from the very start, they're used to, you go for an appointment at a hospital, and you brought into a place and you meet some patients who then start talking to you about, and you would see some of the people in the selection group, and they're looking at their watch and wondering when the doctor's going to come, because that's sort of the model they had in mind, to wait for the doctor to come so they could start the interview. And eventually they realise, this is the interview. And you go, oh, what, you mean, oh. And so it messed with the head, as it were, almost from the start, which, in constructive ways, because one of the things also about then the professional expertise, if you think about, this professional expertise in psychotherapy and all those things for which I have a respect, but not as much respect as some of the psychotherapists might want me to have, but part of the issue would be that if you then work with the psychotherapist in a psychotherapy context and you hate them with a passion, a real absolute passion, because in that sort of transference, if you like, they are abusing you in the way that you were mistreated and abused before, and there's absolutely no question that this therapist is an evil and nasty person. That concretised transference in a way. And at the end of the group, you're playing football on the lawn together, or making a cup of tea, or making some sandwiches, and it's almost like you can sometimes see people looking at you and go, but I hated you, and actually now I don't, and it's that sort of that's, I think, where the therapeutic engine was turning, because it was the culture of inquiry. It was forcing everybody, staff and residents, to think about what was going on in that moment. Yes, I am actually the person that you were hating this morning. So maybe we can think about that when we go back, because and so there is something about that psychosocial bit, moving from the psycho to the social and back again, that the professional trained people needed to be able to do very skillfully, and some could do it naturally, more naturally than others. Tended to be that the doctors struggled. The nurses, I think, were much better at it, because nursing care has tended to be a sort of 24/7, getting alongside, activity-based sort of thing as well. Psychologists weren't terribly good at it, for similar reasons to the psychiatrists. In fact, the Henderson for a long time didn't employ any psychologist. I don't think it ever employed any psychologist in the residential service.
Well, I wonder, I've never worked in a true TC, but two residential services that I have worked in have shared some similarities, and I wonder if one of the things that you're getting at, because all people, whether it be the staff or the people who've lived in these services, tend to get quite passionate about the services that they've participated in, and I wonder if part of that is about the belonging, and actually if you're clinging onto your power by virtue of your professional status, then it stops you from belonging in the same way, doesn't it? Whereas I think a lot of the people who live there, or the people who work there in other roles, quite often what people talk about, I think, is about feeling seen, being able to be authentic, being able to be there as a whole person.
I mean, the demands, say in some of the more professional contexts that other people work in, is that I've got my session, I'll go see my client, and then I'll go to the cafe, go to the library, do all sorts of things. In the Henderson, you arrived at 9 o'clock, you did your shift, and that you were there all the time. You'd have some downtime if that was needed, but you didn't come and go. You were there. Everybody was there all the time, and of course some people couldn't handle that. Because you are immersed, you are a member of the community. If it's going to work for you, and if you're going to work for it, and together you can do it. It's a residential service for the clients, but it is still a place of living, as it were, living, learning, working for the staff as well. I mean, they go home at night, obviously, but while they're there, they're absolutely members of the place.
It's very all-encompassing, isn't it? And it is, yeah. I remember we employed somebody who, said she was a good team player and all the rest of it. But of course, actually, being a team player is not when you're working in a community setting where you only see your colleagues once a week at a meeting, and you can do whatever you like the rest of the week. It's quite different to a setting where everyone knows where you are all day, every day. And it's sometimes that's too much visibility for some people.
Indeed,
I think
that was part of the modelling, is that you say good morning when you arrive, and you say good evening when you leave, and that you say hello to people as you go along, and even things like that. I mean, I the number of acute wards that I've consulted to, when people turn up to their shifts, go into their office, have their handover, don't say hello to anybody, come to the end of their shift and just disappear, and don't say goodbye to anybody, at the same time espousing nonsense about attachment and separation and loss. You think, well, actually these attachments and separations and losses are to be explored in every encounter, every day, all of the time. So that if you're not there, one of the things that used to say at the Henderson, of course there are times when you're not going to be here because you're off duty and all of those sorts of things. But in effect, what you're saying is that when you're not there, you're saying something somewhere else is more important. And so it has to be, if you're not there because something somewhere else is more important, you need genuinely for that to be true. So I'm at home with my family. That's more important. That could be understood. I've nipped down, to do to the shops to do my, to do my shopping. That's not important. So the communication is being here together in this place is what we do, and that level of demandingness isn't for everybody, of course, but I think that's part of what's therapeutic, what was therapeutic about it, and all of these places had a name, so the Henderson, as it were, the Hendo. There was also something quite important about that in terms of the belonging, because everyone would have an idea in their head of the Hendo, as a thing, transference object, if you like, that is containing and holding their experience in relation to their sense of belonging. Very rarely would people have that experience in general location, in a prison, or or on an acute unit. I'm part of Bluebell ward. I mean, it's like it doesn't happen. And
Mm-hmm. Do you think? Do you think that the flip side of that, though, is that you, as a strategic leader, you end up not belonging to your host institution at times? So you belong to the community, but you don't belong in the bigger, wider trust.
I think that is a major contributing factor, and one of the issues that I think has been described is that therapeutic communities do better either in specialist organisations, where the whole organisation is dedicated to that purpose, so everybody has got the same song sheet, or in relatively small host organisations, so you can have some sort of direct conversations with people about, we're not being rude, come and visit us, we've got visitors days, and with an expectation that people would actually come because they're interested, because they're part of the wider hosting organisation. Massive, great big organisations that they ended up in, you're a tiny little speck, no one visits, no one comes, and nobody goes, so it becomes very fraught. And part of the function of the outreach team was to try to offset some of that turbulence at that boundary. So a lot of the work that we're doing in the outreach team was, if you like, public relations work, with the referrers, with the host trust, doing training, consultation, doing, all sorts of things to keep them sweet, really, so that they go, oh, yeah, I don't know what they do over there, but we quite like this outreach team, or whatever it is. So they would leave it alone, because you didn't want them turning up, in a snap inspection or whatever it would be, that, just arriving in some sorts of ways. And some people, some new managers, would have that sort of expectation. Oh, I'll pop along on Monday morning to see you. Well, no, we'll need to negotiate it with the community. What? How does that work? We can't just have people wandering about the building. Because that was the other bit. Of course, the protection of the building included the ways in which you answered the door, the way in which you answered the telephone. So there was always an idea that if someone rings up the place and says, "Can I speak to Naomi?" And you don't know who it is, you would say, "I can neither confirm nor deny. I don't know who Naomi is." You see, you wouldn't. You would always be looking to protect the boundary of the organisation from intrusion, and of course that included the trust and the managers. And of course they didn't necessarily understand that when they were so used to just turning up in places, or working according to their diary rather than negotiating with patients. Negotiate with patients about coming to a meeting. And I'm not, why would I do that? Well, they need to know who you are. You're a stranger wandering about in their home. Oh, okay, I suppose when you put it like that, but you have to have all these conversations all of the time about why strangers wandering about in a building might be disturbing to people.
And why the patient should come first.
Yeah, well, indeed, that's what that too, yeah.
I was just going to say, and you have to have these conversations repeatedly, because there are always new faces coming in.
Absolutely.
And that can be quite exhausting. I'm a bit aware of time. Do you have any more questions that you wanted to ask Naomi?
No, I think probably that's such a rich interview. I think we've probably got absolutely loads there, so it's been brilliant. I really enjoyed the candid way that you've spoken, Chris. It's been really thought-provoking.
That has been a really rich description you've given us. I did just want to give you a chance to say something about the unhoused mind, which I think is where a lot of your thinking has gone on over the last few years. You've certainly written a lot about it. Would you like to say a few words about that?
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, first of all, it's work that I've done collaboratively with John Adlam. So it's not my work. It's our work. Just to say that, but But I think it is about homelessness, really, and thinking about homelessness as not simply about not having a house, and there's something about the experience of trauma, that means that you end up beside yourself, or out of your skin, or out of your mind, or some sort of notion like that, which means that you're not embodied, for instance, in terms of you lose contact with the body as a place of housing, and lose connection with the group, whether that's an individual or the group, so that the experience is one of rejection, detachment, exclusion, rather more than some of the things that we were trying to think about here, about belonging, inclusion, connection, thinking, and those sorts of things. So it's almost the antithesis of what we've been saying. But part of the invitation is, instead of calling it, to use the metaphor, of about, we're all searching for a place to be, a place to belong, a place to be recognised and seen, and that for many of us that might be a place called home. If you don't have such a place called home, then you are homeless, and some homeless people live in a house, and some don't. But this idea of the unhoused mind is in a way, I think, a sort of synonym for a personality disorder at one level. But I think it's also a comment really about the inhospitality and the hostility of the host organisation or society in general, because I think it's not a psychological state that people get into. It's a psychosocial state. Is that they are right to think that they're not wanted and not liked and excluded. So that's not a pathology. That's an accurate observation about the way in which they've been treated. So the unhousedness has to think about both the housing and the housed, if you see what I mean. Who's housing whom and in what sort of way. And in that way, what we're trying to think about is not just about thinking about people with traumatic histories, but thinking about the traumatised society in which we're all living in. The example, I guess, at the moment about institutional racism, in a way that's saying something about that it's very hard for people of colour to feel housed within a hostile environment. Now, is it, whose problem is that? Well, the problem is clearly the hostility of the environment, rather than the experience of the unhoused persons. And then, of course, you could understand something about why people behave as they do when they're not accommodated and housed and brought in and included in all sorts of conversations. So it's something about that, really. How do we house and accommodate each other in society, but also in each other's minds? And that's part of the challenge, is that housing ourselves in each other's minds is, I think, what we've been talking about in terms of the treatment model, but it's also about the model being housed within the host institution. It's also then about the mental health services capacity to think about trauma. It's then, and wider it goes then in terms of the education system, the social system, the political system. Everybody's unhousing everybody all of the time, and that if we can't sort of think about that psychosocially, then we're in danger of just pointing fingers and saying, oh well, we're all right, it's just these disturbed people.
Seems particularly pertinent when you kind of think about the causes of extremism.
Well, I was about to say.
Sorry, Chris.
I was about to say that. That terrorism is the latest sort of trope, really, isn't it? Or extremism, or whatever it is that they are simply mad, crazy terrorist people. Let's pause and look at the history of colonialism and neoliberalism and capitalism and the Christian right's domination of discourses across the world, and then wonder why people from other cultures don't feel that they've got a voice.
Shows the short-sightedness as well of solutions that depend on trying to change those individual, exactly. Highlight those individuals and change them, exactly. When changing society might actually be more fruitful and productive and mean that we have to be less accurate with our assessments.
Yeah, well, I think that was the issue at Henderson was of course is that the emphasis was always and everywhere on the Henderson as a place that has to think all the time about how we accommodate, empower, and find a way of being together in a way that's respectful, not judgmental, and so on. So it's not the treatment, if you like, is the Henderson. It's not any of the individual staff. The treatment was the Henderson. That was the transference object in the mind. That was the good object. You could hate the staff and love the Hendersons. Very, very. That was pretty much the trope. An awful lot of the patients would just absolutely hate the staff with a passion, but love the Henderson. And stay there and engage with it and so on. And it became as if it were a real thing. And of course, it is a real thing. You think about the matrix in that sort of way, and then think about the housing in that sort of way.
Great. I realised that I was opening a portal to a place of deep thought that you and John had done over the years. But I think you've given a really excellent little description of the kind of thinking that you've been doing and how it links up with these other issues around the Henderson and the treatment model there. So thanks a lot, Chris.
Yeah, it's been brilliant. A really great thought, really inspiring conversation. Thank you.
Well, maybe I could just, before ending, just to say I miss it very much. Personally I miss it, but the gap that it's left for, that has not been filled for some of these very, very vulnerable people, it just drives people to suicide and murder.
Yeah.
If you've got nowhere else to put this stuff, hating the staff and loving the Henderson is a fantastic opportunity because it allows you to be housed and hate at the same time. If you're unhoused and full of hate, that's very dangerous.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's a very good place to bring this to a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Lovely. Right.
That was brilliant.